The Good afternoon. Welcome to the Community Climate Hub Summer Webinar Series. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Initiative. My name is Roland Sellinger. I'm a research analyst at the Climate Reality Project Canada. Through several trainings each year, including in Denver and Seattle earlier this year and in Pittsburgh next week, Climate Reality trains leaders to share the urgency and solutions to climate change. We're also helping create community climate hubs throughout the country, Canada, that will help raise the bar on climate action in Canadian cities, while spurring ambition at the provincial and federal levels. This webinar is the 5th in our fall series, which you can see listed on your screen. Sign up for the upcoming webinars at climatehub.ca. These webinars are meant to exchange best practices and tools that you can leverage in your own cities to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. Today's webinar features Andrew Gage, the project lead for West Coast's Climate Law in Our Hands initiatives. The initiative focuses on the power of communities to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for its role in causing climate change. Andrew was an environmental activist before he was an environmental lawyer. He was accepted into law school shortly after being arrested for protesting logging in Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver's island's west coast. Matthew, off to you.
And go ahead, Andrew, take it away. You'll have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Okay, great. If you could bring up the first slide, Matthew, that would be great. So thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be presenting to you today and telling you about the work of the Climate Law in Our Hands initiative and hopefully maybe getting some of you interested in doing some similar work and maybe working with us to hold corporate fossil fuel companies accountable for the local impacts of climate change and to do that through the local governments. So if we could go to the next slide. On the 25th of January of this year, 55 BC-based environmental organizations sent this letter to all of BC's municipalities and regional districts. It asked the local governments to take action against the fossil fuel companies to hold them accountable for local impacts of climate change. We asked them to do that first by sending public letters to 20 fossil fuel companies, telling them about the local impacts and asking them to pay their fair share of those climate costs. And secondly, by asking them to consider a class action lawsuit against those companies. I'd like to start by looking at some of the ways this campaign's different from many other climate campaigns and why we're particularly excited about it. First of all, it focuses on the local impacts being suffered here and now. I'd like to launch the first poll asking how many of you think that we're already seeing the effects of climate change in your communities? I didn't realize both polls were coming up at the same time, but you can either answer both now or we can wait for the...
Yeah, you know what, press ahead and we'll let folks answer as we go along and we'll come back to the answers.
Okay. Okay, I mean, what I was hoping to illustrate is that there really is a lot of public concern about climate change, that 48% of Canadians believe that climate change is already occurring in our communities. And a further 13% think that that will happen within the next 10 years. I have nothing.
So far, the answers are unanimous of those on the.
So you're a little higher on the average than the average, which isn't surprising. Yeah. Now, for some reason, yeah, could you advance just slightly? Thanks. Yeah, I've got nothing against polar bears, but I think that the climate conversation can't just be about polar bears. We have to increasingly talk about how it's our own communities that are affected by climate change. Next slide. And again, the second thing we did was to really talk about the demand that the fossil fuel industry take some responsibility for climate change, including paying a share of the impacts of climate change. That's important on multiple levels. We're always told we're all responsible for climate change, and that spreads guilt pretty darn broadly, but also allows us to really ignore the large and systemic players. It means that we don't discuss the very large role in some companies, players, and especially the fossil fuel industry, in causing climate change, and the fact that they've made a very large amount of money in doing so. It points to a systemic problem, the externalization of the costs of climate change, and the fact that our communities are paying for this rather than the companies that have benefited. And I think as long as one industry is making that type of huge profits without expecting to pay the costs, we're going to have a lot of trouble dealing with climate change and transitioning to a sustainable economy. Okay. It's because they don't expect to pay for these costs that Exxon has misled the public on science, that they've lobbied against climate action, that they filed patents for renewable energy technology and then sat on them. Another poll, or maybe it's already been answered in terms of the poll. The next question I was going to ask here is whether people on the webinar agree that fossil fuel companies should pay a share of the cost of climate change.
So far, the response is unanimously.
Unanimously, yes. Well, it's surprisingly enough, the vast majority of the Canadian public agrees with that. 82%. Sorry, our poll rather is the poll that we have currently is actually for BC, but we think it'll be consistent across the country. 82% of British Columbians agree or somewhat agree that fossil fuel companies should pay a share of climate costs, and 48% of that's unanimous. So we're not alone in that feeling, and yet it's hardly ever raised. Reality is the assumption is that we as taxpayers are going to pay for these costs. And then next slide. Thirdly, the letter claims that our local communities have the power to do something about this, to actually hold these companies accountable. And that may seem surprising because climate change has been such an inherently disempowering issue. It's one that we don't feel we have any control on. But the fact is, it's never been legal to sell products that will destroy the global atmosphere and harm people. And that means that local communities that suffer that harm are well placed, I think both politically and also legally, to challenge the idea that the fossil fuel industry is normal and to demand financial accountability from it. Next slide. It's important to highlight that we're talking about global accountability here. Most climate action that we take is focused on regulating greenhouse gas emissions where they occur. So that means that Canada's best climate plan, national framework on climate change, could at best regulate its 1.8% of global emissions. And we expect, of course, the US to regulate its 15% and Holland to represent its 0.5% and so on for each country. But when you focus for accountability for harm caused to a Canadian community, the legal rules are set by Canadian courts or by the Canadian governments for all of that harm. So theoretically, you could sue Chevron, for example, the largest historic fossil fuel polluter, and it's responsible for about 3.24% of the greenhouse gases that have entered the global atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. The top 20 fossil fuel companies are responsible for almost 30%. And we say that our communities have the legal and political power to demand accountability for those global operations and those global emissions. And so therefore, we're talking about a very big impact indeed. We're not saying that the industry is only to blame and that there's no responsibility of us as individuals. We are saying that they've played a major role and that they're not paying their fair share of the costs. We're not going to have time, I think, in this presentation to go through in detail the legal arguments and the different ways in which companies could be held to be accountable. But in my opinion, the major barriers to this type of accountability are more political than legal. And to the extent there are legal barriers, they can be overcome through political action. And what we're looking at, I think we've got a little flash effect if we just move forward slightly. But probably best just go next slide at this point. Yeah. So the first thing that we asked the governments to do is to send a letter, because the first step in demanding accountability is to publicly ask for it. And really that hasn't been on the radar screen first. We can't allow our our governments, whether local, provincial, or national, to simply use taxpayer dollars to pay for climate costs without at least looking at the question of whether the fossil fuel industries played enough of a role that they should pay a fair share of those costs. And it's really fun to be running, to being able to say to municipal governments, the reason you have the power to do this is because you're already spending money building higher seawalls, dealing with wildfire interface areas, and it would be fiscally irresponsible of you not to seek to recover some of, at least have a conversation about recovering some of those costs from the fossil fuel industry for its role in causing those risks. So far, 2 BC municipalities, Highlands and Saanich, both on Vancouver Island, have voted to send this type of letter to 20 fossil fuel companies. The city of Victoria will be debating doing so tonight. And there are other municipalities considering it. So far, it's been a BC-based initiative. We'd love to see it, taken out of the province and tried elsewhere. But think for a moment what can be done when these letters are sent. If we could go back, thanks. Yeah, shareholders can ask whether the companies agree that they own a fair share and what these letters from these communities mean for the company's profitability. There'll be the potential for media coverage and public discussion about how our communities have been affected by climate change and the role of the fossil fuel industry in causing those risks. I mean, really, in many ways, it's a major paradigm shift. Okay, next. And the companies know that the lawsuits can be brought by affected communities, and that the more public debate about their role in this, the more likely that such cases will be brought and that they'll be successful. None of these cases have been brought yet in Canada. But 5 claims have recently been filed in California, including by San Francisco and Oakland, as well as one more long-standing case in Germany against a German coal company for climate-related costs. So this isn't unprecedented, and the companies, we believe, are worried about it. Chevron earlier this year disclosed for the first time to its shareholders that there was a possibility of litigation against it. Interestingly enough, there's fairly broad public support for this. Our polling said in BC, anyhow, 63% of British Columbians would support their local governments bringing a lawsuit of this type to recover some of the climate costs. It's not just about local governments either. I mean, I view this as being, sorry, next slide. I view this, it's not about local governments, accountability letters, or lawsuits. Those are just some of the important tools that we've identified. It's really about reframing the debate about climate change. We've tended to characterize climate change as being a far-off threat that even our governments don't really have a lot of control over. And if we can emphasize that the threat is here and now, and we have the power to do something about it, that is not normal to destroy the global atmosphere, and that we need to make sure that those who profit from doing that don't shift the costs onto the rest of us. That's a major shift in how we've articulated the climate change conversation. And I think it's a very exciting one in terms of actually making it clear that if we continue down this road of climate change, the consequences are not just serious for our communities, but are also serious for the companies that are profiting. Next slide. So to summarize a bit, we're looking for partners that want to demand that the fossil fuel companies pay their fair share of the climate costs facing our communities. And by having that discussion, our local communities can send a global message that the fossil fuel economy is causing us harm and that that's not acceptable, and actually ultimately create a real financial risk to these companies, which then affects their investors, affects their insurance companies, affects what they have to disclose to their investors. It ripples through the economic system in ways that are really quite exciting. So next slide. And that's it for me. I'd like to acknowledge some of the foundations that have allowed us to do this work. And I think we're moving into questions. I stayed to close to 15 minutes, so we've got a bit of time for discussion. And I'll be interested to hear people's reactions, comments, and questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today, and even more so being that you're traveling at the moment and working outside of your native BC. I'm going to give a very brief presentation about the Climate Hub campaign, and then we're going to move into question and answer. Folks listening in, participate using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or in the chat function if you'd prefer. So just to quickly recap the polling results, we had 86% of respondents saying we already are suffering direct impacts from climate change, and 14% saying that we would be in the next 10 years facing those impacts. And the second question, also roughly the same percentage, 85 and 15. So in terms of strongly agree with fossil fuel companies needing to take action, and somewhat agree that they should be held accountable for those costs. So very quickly, just to run through what we're asking folks to do, and within the Climate Hub campaign, there are opportunities to take advantage of campaigns like Climate Law in Our Hands. Community groups across the country can choose kind of targets that are relevant to their own communities, some of which may choose to run a campaign about holding fossil fuel companies accountable. Others, depending on their context, might choose to run other projects. And part of this webinar series is intended to provide those alternatives, provide options for people to say, okay, I've got a local group in my city. I'd like to get active. I'm going to do this to hold my city accountable. I'm going to do this to hold fossil fuel companies accountable. I'm going to do this to get involved in a specific area in my city that is producing, inordinate amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So across the country, we are establishing hubs. These are the cities on your screen where between now and the end of the year, a hub will be active. And 7 of them are active at this very moment. And we are increasing the pace in which we are outfitting or equipping hubs to get started. By April of next year, the objective of the Climate Hub campaign will be to benchmark these hubs against each other, to be able to say, okay, who's leading in this, and this respect at the municipal level? Who has got best practices that we can share with others? And how can we advance together in a bit of friendly competition, but with the recognition that climate progress doesn't happen through rhetoric nor through chance, but rather through saying, okay, here's our emissions profile. Here are the areas we need to reduce. This is what we're going to focus on in our city. We can be the innovators in this space because, we have this unique opportunity. And then those solutions can be exported to other jurisdictions as well. So that said, I won't get into any more of that, and we'll jump straight into questions. So we've got one in the registration form and another here in the Q&A. So let's start with this. Kaboon asks, that was a great presentation, first of all. So thank you, Andrew, again. How much do you think those companies should pay? Will a carbon tax be sufficient to offset their responsibility?
Right. So there's an excellent body of work done by a scientist in the States named Richard Heady. It's known as the Carbon Majors Report. And is a peer-reviewed, the original research was a peer-reviewed journal article. It's since been updated. And what he did was he looked at how much oil, gas, and coal different fossil fuel companies have produced over their lifetime. Based on industry averages, when that was sold and burnt, how much can we expect that resulted in terms of their of emissions from those products and the emissions of the company's operations in extracting those fossil fuels from the ground. So our starting point has been to use those percentages as what we think is the fair share of the companies. So Chevron's, I think I mentioned, is 3.24%. Of the costs, and those costs, of course, are going to rise as climate change gets worse, and we feel the impacts more and more. I think the companies could argue that, and one of the things we'd love to have is a debate about what the right percentage is. If they want to say it's less than 3.24%, that'd be a great discussion to have. In terms of the carbon tax. A carbon tax is a regulatory measure. It's a law brought in. It's not based on liability. It's not based on the the idea that these companies have owe us something under existing legal rules. It's based on bringing a new rule on emissions. It tends to be targeted at end users rather than the companies that are taking this out of the ground. So you and I at the gas pump pay the carbon tax. The fossil fuel companies sort of only indirectly have an effect. And it also, because it's a regulation rather than sort of a rule of liability, it can only be applied to those companies that are active within your jurisdiction. And it's not usually done in respect of their global operations. It's usually done in respect of their emissions here in Canada or in whatever province is bringing in the carbon tax. So what we're saying is that these companies should be responsible for their global contribution to climate change and the global risks that they've created for our communities, not just what happens to have been done in Canada. One of the big problems we've had in climate change is that we think we can only regulate what occurs in Canada or whatever occurs in our own jurisdiction. And as a result, there's this tragedy of the commons where we get the full economic benefit of burning fossil fuels here, but only a very, very small portion of that actually harms us. Whereas this approach allows us to demand global accountability for their operations, and a carbon tax doesn't do that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew, and Kaboon for the question. Winnet asks from Ottawa, do you see this type of lawsuit as a complement to citizens suing their own governments for lack of action?
Yeah, great question. I see them as being I see areas where there's where they work well together and areas where they're actually sort of in tension with one another to a certain degree. I mean, I think both of them do a great job of emphasizing that climate change is not, dealing with climate change is not a political choice. It's not something we can choose to do or not. It is a legal imperative. And both of those types of lawsuits are very important for that reason. The cases that have been brought against governments, one of the challenges is the same one I was talking to. You're stuck within your national borders. So a lawsuit against Canada would be in respect of Canada's 1.8% of global emissions, or possibly slightly more if you manage to look at their exported emissions. But the lawsuits against the companies are, as I say, global in nature, and there's a huge advantage to that. And I think that focusing too much on governments can let companies off the hook, whereas actually holding the corporations accountable creates the political space for governments and for courts, indeed, to take more aggressive action, because it challenges that fundamental assumption that so much of our society has, that this fossil fuel industry and economy is necessary and economically and wealth creation and job creation driver. And I think as long as that isn't challenged, there's only so much that we would expect to win through court cases against government, or for that matter, from our government. But by challenging that, we create the political space for a lot else to happen. So to a certain degree, they're complementary, and at a certain degree, I think that it's important to be clear what each does, and they are slightly different.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Laurel from Montreal. This is a question close to our heart because we've been involved quite closely in the head office here in Montreal with an issue with the pension fund. So pension funds that invest in fossil fuel companies, particularly when it's public money, would you recommend a similar approach to hold the pension fund accountable? Would there be any legal recourse to say, you as a pension fund, right, or managing public money should not also be investing in things that are destroying the planet? It's not an investment. I mean, there's
certainly a lot of interest in that as well in a number of countries, and I think that there is a credible case to be made that investment fund managers have to pension fund managers have to consider the risks, obviously, of the fossil fuel economy, both financial and otherwise. I'm certainly not opposed to people who want to go down that route. I mean, my own take is still that until it's really clear that this industry is only profitable because it's offloading its costs onto us, it's going to be difficult to convince pension funds and other investors to really take the risks seriously. But the more we even talk about the fact that they're offloading their costs onto us, the more risk we actually create that can be sort of then paid attention to by the pension funds. But I'm not knocking that as an approach, and it's been just not been the focus of our work so much.
Okay. Question from one of the registrants, Rishika in Montreal, in fact. Can you describe one or two notable changes or milestones? It's a bit more generic, not necessarily directly related to climate law in our hands, but milestones in the field of environmental law at the municipal level in Canada, North America, or the EU. What are you excited that's coming down the pipeline, so to speak?
At the municipal level, certainly, I mean, the lawsuits in California are really quite exciting. It's very important for our work in our campaign, obviously. But municipalities on climate change, I think, have been taking a leadership role. I mean, the commitments of several municipalities, including Vancouver, to work towards 100% renewable energy, and obviously that's a goal rather than something that's been achieved. But I think that's a very major commitment that has to be applauded. In terms of, I think the original question was about environmental law more generally. I mean, I think we've had a time of flux in environmental law at the federal level with the previous government rolling back of a lot of environmental laws, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what advances we see in environmental law as some of those rollbacks are reversed, and the current federal government looks at new ways to modernize environmental statutes that are maybe more in line with the values that that we may hold. I'm not sure if that answers the question well or not, but.
Well, we'll ask Rishika next time I'm in touch with her. With that in mind, does the federal government, does the tone and the tenor of the discourse at the federal level impact to any degree what's possible in the judicial system in terms of setting precedents? Do you feel as though now, under a government that takes climate change a little bit more seriously, if I can put it that way, do you feel like there is an increased chance for judicial precedents to be set? Is there any correlation, either explicit or otherwise?
I mean, I think the case could be made of yeah. I mean, it's a complicated relationship. I think sometimes having a government that's been hostile to environmental issues has actually increased the willingness of the judiciary to intervene. But it's a complicated relationship, and obviously, I mean, one thing that we've focused our campaign so far on local governments demanding this type of accountability, but there's also potential to have this conversation at the federal level and at the provincial levels. Yeah, I think that the original question you asked is probably there's a relationship, but it's very complicated and not something you can point to easily. But yeah, the more sympathetic government has obviously created some space for conversations that weren't there before.
Okay, great. So let's say I'm somebody living in Eastern Canada. I'm in St. John's, New Brunswick, and I want to pursue my municipal government and ask them to send a letter to fossil fuel companies, or I want to eventually,
Right.
Ask them to mount a suit. How do I go about doing that?
Right. Well, first of all, we have a lot of resources on our website, wcl.org, that include template letters. It includes a spreadsheet of the 20 largest fossil fuel companies and their mailing addresses and their respective percentages contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions under the Carbon Majors report, as well as a sort of backgrounder for local government on why they should be sending these types of letters. So those resources are all available. We'd also be happy to chat with people who are interested in advancing those, like making a submission to their government and asking them to do that. We have some experience with how well, what has worked and what hasn't worked here in BC, and we're still learning on that. But basically, I mean, I think there's those types of resources for someone who wants to use that specific tool. I also just encourage people when they are, whatever your climate campaign is, to sort of keep in mind this question of what is the role of the fossil fuel industry and how can I raise that in the campaign I'm doing? Because as I say, it's not just about these tools. It's also very much about, do we think we can actually win the climate change fight while ignoring this elephant in the room of this hugely profitable industry that's profiting because they don't expect to ever pay the costs of this. They expect us to pay it. It's a conversation that we desperately need to have as these climate impacts get more obvious and worse. And it doesn't have to be through these letters. And anyone who's running a campaign can think of ways to incorporate those messages and those questions into it. I think you're muted.
Yep. One more that slipped into my mind while we're concluding. Precedents in the fossil fuel industry, in the tobacco industry. Were tobacco companies ever held to account directly, or was it just regulation that was slapped on them?
No, they were held accountable in a number of US cases. There's one Canadian case that's much more recent. What was interesting in Canada is that because it wasn't obvious that we'd be able to recover against the fossil fuel companies under existing Canadian law, a number of most of the provinces, I think almost all of the provinces, passed legislation making it easier to sue them. And that is an option that can and should be discussed here in Canada for climate litigation too. I see the tobacco litigation, though, as less being a legal precedent, although there are elements that clearly are, and more a sort of social precedent. There was a time period when everyone assumed that smoking and the health problems caused by smoking and the cancers and everything were all the fault of the responsibility in those harms. And that shifted very rapidly as people began talking about the role of the industry in suppressing the science, the profits that had been earned by the industry, and recognizing that there was this broader systemic role of sort of selling a product that you knew was addictive in some often very manipulative ways. I mean, there's some huge precedents, I think, there in terms of how we changed how we viewed tobacco and the role of these large players.
Great. The final question we have here in the Q&A is, if we succeed in forcing companies to pay more of the cost, will they be able to turn around and say, okay, well, based on NAFTA, you've changed you've changed the goalposts, and therefore now we can demand reparations?
Well, quite the contrary. I mean, that's actually one of the concerns around most regulation of fossil fuel companies. And it's one of the reasons that if possible, I think we want to try to establish this type of liability under existing law. Because if we can say, as I think we should be able to say, it has never been legal for you to sell a product that is devastating our communities. If anything, you owe us money. That's not changing our law. That's actually, clarifying what the law always was. And even if it's done through legislation, I think the legislation should aim to clarify some of these key legal questions rather than fundamentally create new liability. Because if they bring those NAFTA claims, we need to be able to say, this isn't a question of you being compensated for something you were entitled to do. You're now asking for compensation for something you had no right to do. In fact, that you were causing harm that was itself illegal. I think it's very important that we establish that precedent rather than giving them the in to say that that they've somehow been deprived of the right to pollute.
Excellent. With that, we'll conclude. Thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us. And thanks all for attending this afternoon and participating. We hope you come away with some knowledge and inspiration to get active in your community. That is what we're aiming for here. This is not simply an educational exercise. It's an exercise to say, here's a tool. What are you going to do with it? So we're here to help. We have regional organizers established in BC, in the Prairies, and in Ontario, as well as our head office here in Montreal. So if you'd like to get a group started in your community to support each other in doing things like a letter to fossil fuel companies on behalf of your municipality, or a number of the other projects we've proposed on previous webinars and at climatehub.ca, we would more than happily support you in launching that group and getting members of your community together to take action. Our next English webinar is Tuesday of next week, the 17th at 5 p.m. Eastern, and we'll feature Chris Adam, Sustainability Director at Dawson College. He is, I'm not going to say single-handedly, but almost responsible for taking Quebec's largest cégep carbon neutral. So he's really a leader in terms of institutional change. From within an institution, what can you do? So you can sign up on the same site, climatehub.ca. Thanks again, and we will see you next week. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.